So there are two reasons I'm making this video. The first reason is because every video or post I've seen about the Stop Killing Games initiative shows overwhelming support without anyone actually questioning it. The second reason is because of Jason Thorhall, better known as Thor from Pirate Software, and the constant harassment he has faced over his entirely legitimate criticisms of the movement. Jason has been one of the few public voices to seriously challenge this initiative, and it's made him a target. What started as people calling out his stance quickly escalated into dissecting everything he has ever done, be it his work history to his game development skills, all in an attempt to discredit him as a game developer. I saw his original post where he said he hoped the initiative failed and that he would do whatever he could to stop it. And while I disagree with some of the things he said, he's entitled to his opinion. But what's completely unjustified is the claim that he could be sued for misrepresenting the initiative, whether on social media, during live streams, or in videos. How can you misrepresent something that's this vague? And that vagueness is exactly why I agree with Jason. This initiative might sound good on the surface, but it's dangerously underdefined, and that can make it harmful for video games in the future. And the only real issue I had with Jason's coverage of the Stop Killing Games initiative was that he didn't go deep enough. So in this video, I'm going to ask the hard questions about what this initiative argues for and what it might lead to. Let's start by looking directly at the mission statement of the European Citizens Initiative itself. According to the initiative, its goals are: this initiative calls to require publishers that sell or license video games to consumers in the European Union or related features and assets sold for video games they operate to leave said video games in a functional, playable state. Specifically, the initiative seeks to prevent the remote disabling of video games by publishers before providing reasonable means to continue functioning of said video games without the involvement from the side of the publisher. The initiative does not seek to acquire ownership of said video games, associate intellectual rights, or monetization rights. Neither does it expect the publisher to provide resources for the said video game once they discontinue it while leaving it in a reasonably functional, playable state. It sounds reasonable, but once you dig beneath the surface, that statement starts to unravel because it raises more questions than it answers. What type of games does this apply to? What does playable even mean? Is it even possible to disconnect the game from its publisher without requiring proprietary tech? And if publishers don't have to provide resources, how would any of this be achieved? And that's why this initiative isn't just fake, it's potentially dangerous. There are four core problems I believe we need to confront head on. Problems that could have serious consequences if this ever leads to legislation. And the problems are as follows. What type of games are being targeted? Will developers be forced to give up proprietary resources? Who exactly will write and shape the laws? And will this open the door to government overreach? Let's break those down one by one. Let's have a look at the first core problem. What types of games are being targeted? Now, I know this initiative started because of the shutdown of The Crew, an online-only racing game published by Ubisoft and co-developed by Ubisoft Ivory Tower and Ubisoft Reflections. Now, Ubisoft didn't just take the servers offline. They removed The Crew from players' libraries entirely, which was a move that triggered widespread backlash, and for good reason. Losing a game you bought isn't just frustrating, it's what this initiative claims to prevent. Now, the initiative states that publishers should leave games in a functional, playable state, but it never defines what that means or which types of games it applies to. So let's dissect that. Is it for physical games or digital ones? For instance, a physical copy of Elden Ring doesn't require online servers to run. If you own the physical media, you can play anytime you'd like. However, for the digital version of Elden Ring, if the storefront pulls the game and you haven't already downloaded it, you're out of luck. Not to mention the physical game already states server shutdowns on the back of the box. Digital ones, however, you often find out too late. So what about single-player games? Games like 2018's God of War and The Witcher 3 don't require servers or multiplayer features to function. Are these titles even at risk? If publishers stop all support, these games will still play fine. So would they be exempt? Now let's consider online-only games. Destiny 2, Final Fantasy XIV, The Crew, or Star Citizen. These can't function without central servers. If publishers kill those servers, the game is gone. But how exactly would they be required to leave it playable if it hinges on proprietary tech? What about subscription services? World of Warcraft, Xbox Game Pass? You don't own these games, you lease them. Would the law apply to games delivered via subscriptions? Can publishers be forced to maintain non-owned software? None of this is clarified in the initiative, and that's a massive oversight, because different game types will require different preservation methods. You can't write preservation laws without knowing what you're preserving. Let's continue to the second core problem. Are developers forced to give up tech? Now, this may sound redundant. After all, the initiative states that publishers will not be required to provide resources in order to leave games in a functional, playable state. But that raises a deeper question. What does playable actually mean? And how would developers keep games playable without giving up proprietary tech? Let's assume laws get passed. Publishers are now legally obligated to leave games playable after shutdown. What does compliance actually look like? For some games, preservation will be easy to do. Call of Duty games have single-player campaigns. If servers shut down, the offline content still works. Souls games like Dark Souls or Demon Souls lose online messaging and invasions, but the game itself still runs fine. We've actually seen this already with Demon Souls on the PS3. When servers were shut down in 2018, the game remained fully playable. So would titles like this be exempt from preservation laws? Or would developers be expected to restore full multiplayer functionality, even if that meant handing over custom server logic or re-architecting infrastructure? For some games, this would be far more complicated. What if a title runs on a custom engine tied tightly to server logic? What if it uses AWS, Azure, or cloud-based services developers don't own? What if multiplayer is powered by licensed middleware or encrypted systems? In many cases, publishers couldn't legally share the tools required to make a game playable, even if they wanted to, and that makes compliance impossible without giving away proprietary resources. Take Star Citizen, for instance, an online-only game developed by Cloud Imperium Games. The multiplayer portion of Star Citizen relies on proprietary server mission technology, something the studio spent millions of dollars building. If the servers were to shut down tomorrow, the game would be completely unplayable, and the only way to preserve it would be to hand over the very technology that powers it, which could include custom logic, coordination, and deeply embedded server infrastructure. Who knows, maybe they'd be open to releasing that tech voluntarily. But imagine Cloud Imperium refuses to release their technology to their gaming community. Should they be forced to release that code by law? That's not just risky, it sets a precedent, one that threatens innovation and IP protection across the industry. For the sake of argument, let's say that Cloud Imperium is granted an exemption. What's to stop other studios from getting the same exemption, creating a fragmented mess of legal exceptions and unequal enforcement? Some studios will be okay releasing tools voluntarily, others won't, and they shouldn't have to if they don't want to. Preservation should be a choice, not a mandate, especially when the tech involved is proprietary, expensive, and potentially business critical. The initiative might claim no resources are required, but that's not entirely true for online-only games. In fact, for many titles, it's impossible to preserve gameplay without sharing resources. So either the law forces developers to give up their tech, or the law is toothless, unable to enforce preservation in the games that need it the most. And that's the contradiction at the heart of this initiative. And that brings us to the third and possibly most overlooked problem with this initiative. Who will write the laws? Let's say that the initiative succeeds. It reaches the European Commission and lawmakers begin evaluating whether video game preservation legislation should be introduced. So who will influence that conversation? Ross Scott, creator of Accursed Farms and founder of the Stop Killing Games movement, has been a vocal driving force for the initiative. But Ross isn't even listed among the official organizers of the European Citizens Initiative. So if he's not the one presenting the technical solutions to the European Commission, who is? Now, according to the initiative's public record, responsibility now falls to the following. I will refrain from trying to pronounce the names as I don't want to butcher the pronunciations. These are the people now tasked with representing the initiative to the European Commission. And here's the problem. Aside from Ross, none of them have gone on record explaining how they'll achieve the initiative's goals. No technical blueprint, no legal framework, no clarification on how to define playable or what types of games are affected. So how can we be sure this team has the right expertise to navigate the legal, technical, and creative implications of game preservation? Now, some might argue this initiative is just meant to raise awareness. It's not going to create laws. And normally, that might be true if this were just a petition, but it's not. This is a European Citizens Initiative. It's a call for action. And this isn't speculation. This is stated on the European Parliament's own webpage. Having received the submission, the Commission is required to publish it in a register immediately and to meet with the organizers at the appropriate level to allow them to explain the details of their request. After an exchange of views with the Commission, the organizers are given an opportunity to present the initiative at a public hearing held by Parliament. The hearing is organized by the committee responsible for the subject matter of the ECI, Rule 222 of Parliament's Rules of Procedure. So even if the organizers are unprepared, or worse, absent, the process moves forward. The Commission will still hold meetings, Parliament will still hold the hearing, lawmakers will still begin evaluating legislation. Now here's the reality. Most lawmakers have little to no experience with game development. They don't understand the technical architecture of server-dependent games. They don't understand creative trade-offs, multiplayer infrastructure, proprietary licensing, or preservation limitations. They will be forced to look elsewhere for clarity. And if no capable voice steps forward to guide the initiative on behalf of consumers, then the most prepared voices in the room, which will be those of industry lobbyists representing game publishers, will gladly define what game preservation looks like on their terms. It won't be a hijacking, but a quiet handover. The story of game preservation, reauthored by the very companies it set out to challenge. Now let's move on to the most dangerous aspect of this initiative. What happens when regulation gets out of control? Finally, let's look at the fourth and last core problem with this initiative: government overreach. Up to this point, we've unpacked vague wording, missing definitions, and a lack of technical direction. But here's where things get dangerous. If the most informed voices in the room are industry lobbyists, they won't just influence how preservation laws are written, they'll lay the groundwork for how those laws evolve. And once lobbyists help define the initial framework, they could set the technical requirements for preservation compliance. They could mandate source code submission to verify playability or restrict preservation of titles with controversial narratives, historical violence, or political themes. They could even go as far as to push for publisher-friendly exemptions, creating loopholes that shield corporate interests. And once the groundwork is in place, these rules can quietly expand through committee revisions, litigation precedent, and future policy updates. Now imagine the government establishes new institutions specifically tasked with enforcing these digital consumer protection laws. What's to stop a major game publisher from lobbying these institutions and gaining privileged access to other developers' source code under the guise of compliance auditing or technical verification? In theory, these institutions are meant to protect consumers, but in practice, they could become tools for corporate espionage, allowing dominant publishers to exploit regulatory mechanisms to undermine competition. They could then leverage their privileged access to patent competitors' innovations, locking up ideas before independent developers even have a chance to commercialize them. And while this may sound far-fetched, we've already seen a striking parallel with RANS, Range Asymmetric Numeral Systems, which is an open-source data compression algorithm developed by Jaroslav Duda, which he intended remain patent-free. But in 2017, Google filed a patent on a derivative implementation of RANS. Despite Duda's extensive prior research and clear intent to keep the technology public, it wasn't until widespread backlash erupted that Google abandoned its claim. But then, in 2022, Microsoft secured a patent for another RANS variant, and it reignited fears that vague or overly broad software patents allow corporations to repackage and privatize public domain algorithms. It's a textbook example of how legal ambiguity can be exploited to hijack open innovation, and if enforcement institutions built around game preservation lack clarity, the same fate could await creative works protected by public mandate. And the imbalance doesn't stop at espionage. Large publishers can absorb compliance costs, hire legal teams, and treat fines as overhead. But small studios, they don't have the resources to navigate vague legislation or survive any costly audits. This could lead to small studio shutdowns or worse, buyouts by larger companies who scoop up struggling teams under the guise of rescuing them. The result will be a preservation framework that locks in power, not creativity, ensuring big studios thrive while smaller independent studios vanish. But what happens when the scope of preservation itself starts to shift? If lawmakers expand preservation law to include content guidelines, suddenly lobbyists aren't just talking about format or access, they're talking about morality, optics, and public image. Suddenly, the arguments sound less technical and more ideological. Violent or political games no longer reflect modern values. Preserving outdated narratives damage the industry's reputation. Stories exploring gender, race, or religion require editorial oversight. And just like that, preservation stops being about keeping art alive and becomes curated to reflect political or corporate views. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is the slippery slope fallacy, and normally I would agree. But history has taught us how regulation, even with good intentions, can lead to creative restrictions. Take the Hays Code, for instance, adopted by Hollywood filmmakers from 1934 to 1968. All to avoid government regulation. At first, it was about protecting audiences, but soon it wasn't just sex and violence being sanitized, it shielded authority from scrutiny. Government officials and law enforcement couldn't be portrayed as corrupt, incompetent, or morally ambiguous. The church was off limits to satire or criticism, and religious figures had to be shown with reverence. Even sympathy for criminals was forbidden, and stories that questioned the justice system were quietly rewritten. The end result was a cinematic landscape where power was always noble, rebellion was always punished, and truth was filtered through a lens of moral obedience. And history didn't stop there. Just a few years later, the same censorship leapt from the silver screen to printed page. The Comics Code Authority, which was active from 1954 to as recently as 2011, had stricter rules. It banned vampires, zombies, ghouls, and werewolves. The very word horror and terror weren't allowed in titles. Excessive bloodshed, sadism, and lust were outlawed even if the stories condemned the very acts. Authority figures had to be portrayed with unwavering respect. Criminals couldn't be clever or sympathetic. Religious institutions were shielded from critique. Female characters were tightly regulated. They were stripped of all sensuality and had to be drawn without exaggeration or posed only in ways deemed morally acceptable. The impact on studios was immediate and severe. Publishers like EC Comics, which is famous for Tales from the Crypt, had to shut down entire publishing lines built around horror and suspense. Other studios had to pivot to bland, code-approved genres like romance, humor, and sanitized adventure just to survive. Comics that were once rich with dread, ambiguity, and rebellion became sanitized morality tales, stripped of fear, nuance, and imagination. Today, the same dynamic is still playing out, just with different gatekeepers. The App Store guidelines block games that challenge moral norms or touch on political issues. The payment processors like Visa and MasterCard now influence which games are allowed on Steam. Censorship hasn't disappeared, it's just been privatized. Platform guidelines and payment processors now shape what creators can say, but the outcome feels familiar. Creators censor themselves, controversial stories vanish, innovation shrinks to fit inside what's approved. But thankfully, these restrictions weren't mandated by law. They were self-imposed, quietly wrapped in policy and compliance. And as consumers, we could push back. But now imagine if those same boundaries were codified into law, permanent, unchallengeable, enforced by institutions built for digital protection. Protection like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, better known as DMCA, which was originally designed to protect copyright holders from piracy. But over the years, it's been abused as a legal weapon, used to suppress criticism, block preservation efforts, and silence creators. Developers and archivists attempting to restore or emulate older games have faced takedown notices, even when no commercial intent was involved. Critics have been targeted for fair use content, and modders have been forced offline. Even video essays and game reviews, distinct creative reinterpretations, have been flagged, demonetized, or deleted. Preservation teams can't always share the necessary tools or data because DMCA anti-circumvention provisions criminalize access to systems that are no longer even supported. It's a stark reminder that once laws are written, they can be co-opted, sometimes by the very companies they were meant to regulate. If that happens, reversing course won't be simple. Laws take years, sometimes decades to repeal, and by then, the creative damage will already be done. We won't be preserving culture, we'll be surrendering control while telling ourselves it's progress. When regulators start defining media by ideology or morality, creative expression is the first casualty. And this initiative, with its vague concept of functional or acceptable preservation, could become a blueprint for that kind of overreach. Now, before we pivot to solutions, let's debunk the most common arguments that push for vague and broad preservation mandates. Let's look at some statements that get made when defending the Stop Killing Games movement. For instance, I paid for the game, I should be able to play it whenever I want. Now, this is partially true for physical discs with offline modes, but for online-only titles, if the storefront delists a game, you're locked out. Another statement that gets brought up is, games are art. We don't delete movies or books. And again, this is partially true for physical media. For digital art, whether it's a movie, book, or video game, it's far more fragile. Films were deleted by studios mid-production, and they were gone before they ever released. Streaming services routinely remove content, even critically acclaimed titles, based on licensing or cost-cutting. Ebooks have been delisted from Kindle libraries, making them inaccessible to anyone who hadn't downloaded them prior. So yes, games are art, and like all art, they deserve thoughtful preservation, but we shouldn't pretend that deletion never happens. It does, and games are especially vulnerable. Another popular statement that gets made is publishers should provide a way to keep the game running. And in an ideal world, sure, every game would remain playable long after support ends. But sometimes that's just not possible. The game may rely on third-party technology the studio doesn't own, and the team might not have the technical ability to rebuild or emulate core systems, or the cost to maintain servers or re-engineer offline versions could be financially unviable, especially for small studios. That doesn't mean publishers shouldn't care. A lot of them do, but we also need to be realistic about the difference between wanting preservation and forcing it, especially when it could harm the smaller studios. Another statement that gets made is, we can't rely on goodwill, we need laws. But laws can be hijacked by lobbyists, while goodwill can be reinforced through transparency and accountability powered by consumers. Another very popular statement is, some games have been preserved, why not require it? While it's true that some games like Toontown Online have been preserved by fans with Toontown rewritten, they were done so with the explicit consent of Disney so long as it's free and non-profit. But many other preservation efforts operate in legal gray zones without permission from its original developers. These projects could be shut down at any moment, not because they failed technically, but because they're technically illegal. The final statement we'll look at is, if developers want full control, why sell the game at all? It's because selling a game isn't about giving away its foundation, it's about sharing the experience. Imagine buying a movie. You own the copy, and as long as you own it, you can watch it anytime you'd like. But you don't own the scripts, sets, or editing equipment that brought the story to life. Similarly, when developers release a game, you're granted access to play, and not to dissect or redistribute the internal systems that power it. This balance protects the creative tools and licensed technology behind the scenes, while still honoring the player's right to enjoy the finished work. Preservation should defend that experience without crossing into demands for proprietary tools or infrastructure. Before we talk about how to preserve games in a different way, let's look at how game development has changed over the years and why today's studios can't always meet the expectations we've built around the past. Everyone loves to reminisce about the golden age of gaming: dedicated servers, LAN parties, peer-to-peer multiplayer, and split-screen co-op. But we rarely talk about how those features were built in the first place. The pioneers of that era weren't just developers, they were engineers, architects, mathematicians. They understood the hardware, the rendering pipelines, and the networking protocols. They didn't plug systems together, they built them line by line, and it all came from love. They weren't chasing monetization metrics, they were chasing the magic of interactivity. They wanted fun games where people could interact with one another. But now, game development is more accessible than ever. And don't get me wrong, that's a good thing. It means more voices, creativity, and more experimentation, but there is a trade-off. Some developers, especially those relying on modern engines like Unity and Unreal, no longer build infrastructure from scratch. Features like multiplayer, saving to the cloud, matchmaking, and analytics are often integrated through third-party platforms. Even platforms like Steam offer back-end systems for multiplayer and achievements, but not every game uses them and not every developer knows how to use them. Steam's infrastructure is powerful, but it's optional, and integrating it properly requires technical knowledge that many small studios or solo developers might not have. This means developers don't always own or control the server code, the back-end logic, or the networking stack that powers their game. And when the infrastructure is abstracted away or stitched together with subscription-based tools, planning for a shutdown becomes nearly impossible. Not because teams are irresponsible, but because they generally don't have access to the systems required to archive, replicate, or decommission their game. It's not negligence, it's industry evolution. The rise of user-friendly engines reduced technical knowledge, but also created a generation of creators who may never have worked directly with raw server infrastructure. So if preservation laws demand that every studio provide long-term access and architectural foresight from day one, we risk pushing out the very developers who create for love, not scale. And the industry itself reflects this divide. Massive titles launch with lag, glitches, and hackers, and millions still play them. This shows big companies can afford to be messy, but small ones can't. If we want laws to preserve games with integrity, we need to protect the developers who still care about their craft, not just the ones who dominate the charts. And that means building solutions that reflect how games are built today, not just how we remember them. I want to be clear, this isn't about killing the Stop Killing Games movement. I understand the frustration with game prices getting ridiculously high, and some publishers have even openly stated that they want players to get used to not owning their games. And now we're even seeing it extend beyond software, with companies trying to control the very consoles we paid for, reportedly blocking access or disabling systems that attempt to run used or modified games. It's an attempt to lock players into narrow ecosystems and weaken the concept of ownership entirely. And that's exactly why this movement matters. We have the power to choose and to support studios that believe gamers should own their own games, and to empower developers who build smarter systems that preserve online play and longevity. Because games aren't just products, they're art and culture, and they deserve care and preservation. And while this movement is important, it's beginning to drift toward legislation that's vague, impractical, and harmful, built by people who don't understand how games are made or why they matter. The power belongs with the players, not politicians or corporate lobbyists. The solution isn't in courtroom pressure or regulatory threats. It's in clarity, transparency, and community. It's in letting consumers decide what gets preserved and how. Let's stop waiting for top-down fixes and let's explore how we can build better solutions from the ground up. To move toward meaningful game preservation, we don't need sweeping legislation. We need player-powered, developer-supported solutions built on transparency, consent, and clarity. We could create transparency rating systems like ESRB or PEGI, but focused on access and longevity. Right there on the box in digital storefront, studios could voluntarily disclose a game's DRM status, online dependence, offline support, and monetization models. Players would know upfront what they're buying, and developers could signal sunset plans early, building trust through openness. And when studios inevitably step away, community-led preservation becomes essential. Here are a couple examples of how we could do this the right way. Fan-run projects like Toontown Rewritten, which was revived with Disney's blessing, to OpenRA, Command & Conquer Reborn through open source with permission from its original developers, and Project 1999, a legally sanctioned EverQuest emulator, which also had permission from its original developers, show how respectful and thoughtful preservation keep legacy games alive. But we also need to document what's fading. Independent watchdog sites could track shutdowns, catalog delisted DLCs, and flag disappearing content. We can't stop every closure and shutdown, but we can create records, issue warnings, and preserve what's still within our reach before it vanishes silently. If information is power, let's make it searchable. Imagine a transparency curator system like that of the DEI curator system on Steam, dedicated to preservation. Players could filter games by DRM status, online requirements, infrastructure ownership, monetization model, and long-term support disclosures. It's an ecosystem of accountability built not through regulation, but visibility. Because clarity builds trust, and when studios get it right, players should reward them. Because the most important thing we can do is voting with our wallets, and this means backing developers who can offer clear sunset plans, offline options, and honest monetization. Just look at Helldivers 2. Players spoke up and the studio listened, and they reversed a controversial policy. This is what responsible preservation looks like. A community-driven movement where information fuels accountability, advocacy shapes culture, and every dollar spent becomes a vote for the future of video games. This isn't about one voice shouting the loudest. It's about thousands of voices preserving what they love, voting with their wallets, and building a better industry together. Let's protect what makes games special, and let's do it in a smart way as a community. Now, to the creators of the Stop Killing Games initiative, I know that this may be a lot to ask for, but maybe it's worth considering. Maybe you should postpone the initiative, not because you're wrong, but because you may not be fully prepared for what's behind the door you're about to open. Preservation matters, and there's no question about it. But who knows, maybe you planned all of this out. Maybe you've already considered the technical gaps, legal gray zones, and real world effects that this would have. But if not, I hope that this helps you see what might be coming before it's too late. This is a controversial topic, one that too often gets oversimplified, sidestepped, or misunderstood. I felt it deserved more depth and more care than it's been given, so I've done my best to surface overlooked angles, unspoken realities, and the technical challenges that rarely get talked about. If even one person walks away with a better understanding of the preservation debate, then it was all worth it. Because if we want to preserve games for the future, we need to start by understanding how they're built today. Thanks for listening, and I hope I cleared this up for you.